Hi, this is Val Campbell, and I want to welcome you to the First Chapter podcast. Today we're going to meet a new author. So without any further delay, let's jump right into it. Well, Richard Riccardi, I did get your name right. Is that
Yes, it
did I
is.
pronounce that right? You wrote a book
Absolutely.
called The Wandering Worshipper, which is a really interesting, it's an interesting whole subject, and we could get into this all afternoon probably. And what part of the country do you live in? You mentioned the
Dallas. I'm in the Dallas area. I'm in North Dallas suburb.
oh, you're in Dallas. Oh, I'm so envious. I'm not about Dallas so much, but I've just been trying the hardest way I could to figure out some way of moving down into that lower San Antonio triangle area, just down in there. I live up in the Washington area, up in Cle, which is on the east side of the mountains out of Seattle. I'm a refugee from Seattle. And we laugh about that over here, but this whole area is pretty much populated now by people who have left the city. You just kind of get to the point where you get fed up with it. It's pretty crazy over there. But tell us about the history of the wandering worshiper. How did you get started with that?
Sure. Well, my mom certainly raised me with faith, and I was a cradle Catholic, and so I got all the sacraments. But I have to say that, certainly after my children, she and I helped that to make sure they also got the Catholic sacraments, but that my church attendance was entirely irregular and wholly uninspired. And that was really a generous way of describing it. But of course, running through the back of my mind is my mom always saying, you ought to go to church, and church is a good thing to do. And of course, if you're Catholic, church is a thing you must do. So finally, I decided, well, I'm going to put it to the test. Is going to church a good idea? And so I embarked upon this journey. And the reason why there's so much variety in the journey is because I wanted to keep myself interested. So at the beginning of the year, I set out a goal to say, I'm going to go to church 60% of the time, which is like 32 times. And in order to keep it interesting, I'm going to go to as many different places as I can. So I went to churches of every size, shape, color, faith, denomination, in order to keep it that interesting. And so that was the whole impetus. Just, hey, I'm going to give it a try, and let's see what I find out.
So you're down in the Dallas area. That's Tony Evans' country, I think, isn't it? Did you ever wander over into his?
No, I didn't. Of course, he's very popular, very famous.
Yeah.
Another thing I try to do is keep it as close to my house as possible.
Oh, okay.
I see the diversity in, let's say, my neighborhood or my community, except when my interest in a denomination took me a little bit further.
Sure.
Or I traveled.
So, yeah, I have a little bit of a sort of a similar background. That my mom is from Montana, and she was basically Methodist, kind of, sort of, when I was a little kid, we went to school sometimes, but I was quite an adventurous child, and those adventures eventually landed me in a military Catholic boarding school. So I got the immersion of that environment, so I can relate. And all of the catechism stories and all the stuff that you and I probably grew up with. Did you ever have the opportunity to see a stage show, a play called Late Night Catechism?
No.
Audrey's not doing that play anymore, but basically it was an actress who did a nun. She had a Dominican nun habit, and she would hold catechism class. It was all the Catholics that go on. They would just a riotous time of all those things you remember and the things you forgot that she would bring back from when you were a child, Anyway, so this was a journey of personal faith, a personal of discovery, and I have to chuckle a little bit because of the methodical, deliberate way that you went about this, which is very much of a kind of a business organizational process, which I can totally relate. That's exactly how I would attack something, So if I look like I'm chuckling here, it's like, yep, that's probably not how I would do it. So how did that go from a a journey of personal discovery and faith to writing a book?
Well, I had a little bit of interest in writing over the years. And in fact, after I'd sold my business, I'd done a good amount of traveling. And what I decided to do is write emails about my travels. So, kind of a travel journey. And I would send it to about 100 friends and family. So then I did this church journey, went to all these different churches, and I wrote a little something. And I'll tell you the reason why I wrote is because then COVID broke out and I couldn't travel. So I said, you know what? I'll take the church journey experiences of the last year and convert them into emails. And so then I sent out a series of 20 emails to my friends and family. And then a few years later, I said, I think there's something here I want to turn into a book and expand the message.
So, what did you find when you went on this journey of discovery? What was your was
Well,
there an epiphany? Is there a message you got? What was
oh, yes, absolutely. So I would say I'll give you the conclusion. I'll give you some supporting reasons. What I finally concluded is that there is a place for everyone and everyone needs a place. That there was such incredible variety that people could find a place that they could find their community, people they could relate to, and a faith practice that they could relate to. And that the unique and powerful communities that are located within our churches is something that all of us could benefit from, not only what we might receive from the community, but then what we in turn can contribute to the community and satisfy both needs, the need to receive and also the need to give. But I'll say at the outset, uh, I didn't know near as much as I thought. I thought I was a man about town and I knew a lot of things. But when I got into it, I said, wow, I've never been to this many churches. And that's generally the response I get when I tell someone, well, I've been to 33 different churches in 1 year. And of course, many since that year. They said, oh, I think I've been to a lot of churches, but now that I hear you, I realize I haven't. And I like to say some things like, just like rumors of Mark Twain's death, stories about the negative things at church are largely exaggerated. I found out that they taught me the meaning of we. I discovered where I was most different, I was most welcome, and also discovered that shared values and common human nature don't make us the same, but it gives us a basis for understanding. And so that's, some of the big themes that I uncovered as I went through this journey.
And how by the way, love the pictures of your family. Just you guys just shine, right? Congratulations.
Thank you.
How did your family respond to this? How old were your kids at the time, and your wife? I
So,
mean, you sat down one night and you said, "Honey, I want to go to a different church every week for a year," basically, or something like that.
yeah. So my children are older, we're empty nesters. They lived out of state. So they were not implicated in it. Now, with respect to my wife, I would have to say that she's less inspired and less regular than I was. And so she was happy to let me go along on this journey by myself. Um, in fact, she says she liked having the alone time on Sunday mornings. Hopefully that's not a comment on our marriage, but
No.
and I'm joking. It certainly isn't. But now, so it was by and large a solo journey. The advantage of that is then I got to decide where I wanted to go, when I wanted to go, and so that was great. Obviously, my preference would be that she would come with me. She's still irregular, still uninspired, but occasionally she attends with me. And in fact, we're going to our church's marriage retreat this weekend.
Awesome. That's incredible. My wife and I are kind of parallel opposites to you guys. And my wife's from the Philippines. She's much younger than I am. And we always laugh. She says, I'm annoying. I say, hey, that's perfect because you're irritating. And that makes us a perfect pair. If men and women aren't annoying and irritating each other, there's probably something wrong, right? You're not paying enough attention to each other. But she loves to go to church because she loves to sing. And in my case, I spent 45 years studying scripture in the original languages and specific to certain subjects. And um, and I just have to admit that sometimes it's a little hard for me to sit there and listen to the sermons and things, and I'm thinking, oh, this guy, he might have gone to seminary, but they didn't teach the actual Hebrew, scripture or whatever. So
No, I noticed, I read one of your blog posts about marriage, and you went through and got into the ancient text, into the ancient context and the actual original words. And yeah, that's very interesting. But I'll say this. So when you go to church, and I mean, you obviously have an educational background, that's superior to virtually everyone who goes to church. But I look at it this way. Yes, do I agree with everything my church says? And do I like every position? And do I like everything the pastor says? No. Well, which means two things. Number one is maybe I need to change my mind about that subject. I could be wrong about it. That's number one. But then number two is, what is a realistic expectation? As much as my wife and I love each other, she may only agree with me. I have to maintain at least 51% agreement so I don't have to sleep on the couch.
Yeah.
But she certainly doesn't agree with me all the time, and she can love me tremendously. Just like I can love my church, even though, we're not always in total alignment. But we're in total alignment in what I'd have to say is the important things.
Well, and we are talking about positions of faith in Christianity. And it's always been my opinion that, as Christians, you and I really only need to agree on about four things. I mean, we have about four core things. The rest of it is discussion and conversation, and wars have been fought over those things they're not going to affect you and I, and and the core of our faith. And we do have a church that we go to here, but for me, maybe a little similar to, I'm not sure, but what's more of value to me, and where I think that really comes through, is we have a local community of believers that we hang out with a lot. And it's we get together for dinner. There'll be 30 of us there. Of course, it's a Filipino community, and so there's 30 people and food for 130. And that is, when we're there, we pray, we say hi, we have our time. And to me, that's a really valuable thing. But I digressed away from the
No, that actually isn't digressing at all, because that really is the point of the book. Actually, the point of the book is also one of the biggest criticisms I have of the book, because it is not an evangelical call to practice any particular faith. And it is go and seize the benefit of community worship.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's no doubt about it. I've hitched, my horse to the wagon of Christianity, and I believe in Christianity, and I'm going to maintain my Christian faith. But my whole point is, I don't know where you want to get your community, but go and find your community. And I know it's subject to some criticism, but my response to that would be, what is our alternative? Do I need to go out there and beat people over the head with a crucifix and say, get into church? And how effective would that be? Or do we say to invite them in and say, come to the community? Also liken this is, hey, go to church because you like their pickleball league. Go to church because that's where your kids' friends go there. Go to church even if you don't think you need it. You know what happens? Just look at alcoholics. There's a lot of alcoholics who will show up to that first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and go in there and say, I don't belong. It's not for me. I'm not supposed to be here. And then if the community is what we hope it to be, they will help that person find their way. And so that's kind of where I'm at on this book, is I'm just trying to get people into the door. If you're very spiritually mature and you're a theologian and you've been going to church 50 years, 3 times a week, I'm not saying it's not the book for you, because in fact, in a perverse way it is, but the book is an encouragement to get people to come. Now, the reason why it's for people like that who've been there 50 years and have this big self-righteous attitude is, look what you're doing to people. You're turning them off. Mm-hmm. And you should be attracting people.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying compromise your values. You can believe what you believe, but can you do it in a kind and welcoming fashion?
Right.
so that people would be, attracted. And that's really the core of the book, is go and find your community where you receive, and I'll mention this again, where you receive and you have an opportunity to give.
Right. Now, were your children raised in a church community?
Yes. Now, we were raised in the Catholic faith. In a fairly reliable fashion, let's say.
Sure, no, I get it.
That's maybe generous, reliably, but I have to admit, after they got their sacraments, we tailed off in attendance. I'm, just like many people.
Sure.
And so this was a reawakening for me.
When my kids were little, that was a particular point of emphasis with their mom and I, and that was that we were a little bit unusual in parents. We really only had 3 rules. You work in school, no drinking and drugs, and you stay plugged into your church group. And we were very, very active. All of the youth group projects and the Bible studies and everything. And I mean, we were really, core. And I found that as my kids got older into those teenage years, that peer pressure, that influence in their life was immeasurable. I don't know how you can raise grounded kids. Just my personal testimony. I don't know how you can raise grounded kids in this environment today without having that kind of positive sphere of influence that keeps them corralled, if you will.
Sure. I think, and just as much as the church has a positive impact on our youth, it has a positive impact on us, because whether we like it or not, we're subject to society. We at our age are subject to societal pressures. We want to keep up with the Joneses. We see what goes on Instagram, people living their best lives and so forth. And so it's easy for everyone to get their values compromised. And so the church is just a wonderful, wonderful place. Now, churches aren't perfect. And I wouldn't say churches are perfect, and they're not full of perfect people. In fact, they're just like everybody else, full of people just like us who are imperfect. But I like to think that the bad occurs less frequently, and that there's always this persistent aspiration for better.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what distinguishes it. But I'd like to tell you a little story.
Please
about
do.
The power of community. And so I'm in Chicago visiting my children, and I go to a church that's advertised as a Christian LGBTQ church.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's many funny things that happen there. Maybe not funny, ironic. So I walk in there, and guess what? I couldn't tell by looking around what letter of the alphabet they were.
Mm-hmm.
They looked just like me, or I just looked like them. And I knew I was different, and I thought better than them. And then I realized they ought to be worried about what letter of the alphabet I am. It was H, not heterosexual, but hypocritical.
Mm.
And so that was the first little lesson I got, is my own hypocrisy and my own ego. But really something beautiful happened there that I think only happens in the church environment. So the pastor at one point says, "Hey, everyone, stand up. There's a relationship you're struggling with in your life. Turn to your neighbor and just talk about it for a few minutes." So I turned to this young lady, and she's my daughter's age. She goes, "Oh, I'm struggling with my relationship with my father. He doesn't treat my mom right, and he's promised to be better. And it's just been real difficult." And I had to burst her bubble a little bit. And I said, "Well, you can be in your 50s and sometimes have a difficult relationship with your father." But it was nice that she shared that with me. And I said, "Well, I'm a father to a daughter your age." Pastor says, "Okay, everyone sit down. I'm going to deliver the sermon." Deliver the sermon. As I'm thinking about it, I just thought maybe it would be helpful, or it would be helpful for both of us if we just talked about this some more. So I turned to the young lady and said, "Hey, can you stay for a few minutes after church and we can talk?" She goes, "Sure." Well, here it was, 2 strangers who had never met themselves before, but in the church environment, we spent 20 minutes talking after church about a very sensitive issue, father-daughter relationships. And I was her father's age. She was my daughter's age. In fact, after 20 minutes, the security guard said, "Hey, you got to leave." We were meeting in an office building. We spill out onto the street and spend another 10 or 15 minutes talking. And so what was beautiful about that is, would I get that if she was on the bar stool next to me, if she was on the pickleball court with me, or if we were playing video games online? Would we have that same beautiful, touching conversation about one of the most intimate things in our lives where we had to get vulnerable with each other? So I kind of say you must be present to win. And that was one of the circumstances, that just being there. And I couldn't have got that in online church either.
Right. Yeah.
It was a beautiful little experience I had. And of course I have these in my home church all the time.
That's a wonderful story. I did a video not too long ago. I post a lot of videos and just talking about subjects, and one of those videos was about the fact that for many, many years in my life, I had a lot of alternative lifestyle clients. And my kid's mom used to call me the contractor to the gay and lesbian community in Seattle, because there was a couple of years there where all of my clients were gay couples and lesbian couples. And the thing that I find most interesting maybe about that is, if you walk past them on the streets, you wouldn't know. See, people are so much more than the labels that we put on each other. And this was, if I was just to take all of the generalities of people that I've worked with over the years, which is thousands and thousands of people, they were probably the most honorable group of people that I dealt with. I was never cheated. They never withheld money from me. They never did everything. They were wonderful. And once you did a good job for them, like you would do for anybody, they just passed your name around all over the place. And so I love your message that we need to be really careful about these preconceptions and these ways that we label each other. And anyway, I love that story. That's great.
No, and I think that extends to race. What Martin Luther King said 50 years ago, that 11 a.m. on Sunday is still the most segregated time in America, largely holds true today. But for maybe the large churches like a Catholic church or Islam, a mosque, where there's so few of them, you got to pack them in together and you have no choice. It was still, what I would say is that the churches generally did not reflect the racial and ethnic demographics of their community. They did not. But of course I had to try some. And so one of the churches I tried, 3 of the churches I tried were non-denominational Christian churches that had 100% Black congregation. Now, mind you, I didn't just call them Black churches because their identity is in Christianity and they just happen to have a Black congregation. Well, I told you where I was most different, I was most welcomed, that the response to me was overwhelming. I never been hugged and kissed and shaked hands and patted on the back more than I could ever be there. The people were incredibly welcoming to me. It wasn't like, well, here's this liberal white guy who wants to prove he's woke, or, what is he doing here? He's probably going to come 1 week and we're never going to see him again. I never got that feeling. And the feeling was so strong that at one of the churches, I wondered what would happen if I went back. Well, at the end of the church journey year, I had it down to 2 churches. And one of the churches had an all-Black congregation. And I kind of joked to the pastor, and there was another congregation that another church was going to. And so I was like a child of divorced parents. I was alternating every weekend. And so I was going, and I would joke at the pastor, I'm like a bad penny. I keep showing up. And he would just laugh and say, it's no problem. You're welcome every single week. And eventually, at the end of that year, the other congregation happened to be 100% South Asian Indian. So my 2 final choices were either South Asian Indian or Black.
Interesting.
Both beautiful congregations, both beautiful services. At some point, I just decided that I was going to join the Black congregation.
And is that a Catholic congregation?
No, non-denominational Christian.
Oh, I'm sorry, you mentioned that.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
So you, a lifelong Catholic, ended up joining a Protestant.
Yes. And there's a little story behind that too. And what I say about my church is that they taught me the meaning of we. Now, look, it was obvious I was different. You could tell by my complexion. But that I can say unequivocally was never an issue. They welcomed me entirely, and we interacted entirely fine together. I mean, there must have been some times that I said something stupid, maybe a microaggression, whatever you want to call it, but that just never came on up. And you want to know something really incredible? That I told you I did some travel writing, and so I'd written about Charleston, about slavery, racism, plantation homes, and it was Black History Month. 2 months into my joining the church, officially joining the church. Whatever motivated me to send those to my pastor got them. He emails me and says, give me a call. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm in trouble. I got to go to the principal's office now. No, he calls, we talk, and he says, look, these writings are excellent. They'd make a great lesson for Black History Month. And so that weekend on Sunday, I stood before the congregation. It was a question and answer session just like this. And for more than a half hour, the one white guy talked to his all Black congregation about slavery, racism, and plantation homes. And no one batted an eye. And it was just a wonderful experience. And now my white friends who saw it on the internet, they streamed in, said, you know what, you need to go deliver that, not at the Black church, you need to go deliver that at all the white churches. But that's just the kind of acceptance there was and there is. So they taught me the meaning of we. And and now we're 5 years into it. I'm a deacon at the church and a church leader. And I love my congregation. And now more of my type have crawled underneath the fence and joined us. And so while we're still 90% Black, there is a little bit more diversity.
Well, that's just the way it is. You let one of them in, and then pretty soon their friends start showing up.
I was the bad apple. I hope I don't spoil the bunch. And look, I do, wonder, I don't want there's something culturally about the Black church that attracted me, the Black congregation that attracted me, right? And so I hope we don't lose that. But they would say, wait, it's our Christianity that attracted you. And it's our faith that attracted you. And that really is the truth. I'm more worried about it. I can guarantee, I believe, rather, that I'm more worried about it than they would be.
I'm sure. I've got a really strong biology background. And as you well know, the color of our skin is such a micro of our genetics and of our humanity. It's just... And truth be known, we're all Africans. I mean, that is really true. When you take a look at the history of the human race and how this came to be.
The first thing is I'm not a chimpanzee. And why do I say that? Well, because I went to all these different churches of different faiths, non-Christian faiths, and I found remarkable similarities in our values. Of course, remarkable similarities in our human nature. And people say, well, now you're trying to say we're all the same. No, just like I share 99% of the DNA of a chimpanzee, I'm not a chimpanzee. So I'm not saying we're different. We're the same. Excuse me. I'm not saying that we're the same. But you know what? It could give us a little bit of a basis for understanding and acceptance of other faiths. What I say is we may not see eye to eye, but we can walk hand in hand.
Beautiful.
And I think that's real important. I think people miss out on that. Then in terms of race, there was a church I went to, and I call it in my book the Church of Interracial Marriage. And because remarkably, they had the number of interracial couples that you see on TV commercials, but not that you see in the public. but it really was. And I went there twice. It was in Tempe, Arizona, where my kids lived at the time. My daughter lived. And so I went and visited a couple of times, maybe 3 times. And, wonderful congregation. I never got into it and said, hey, why are you here? But there is something that said, wait, as interracial couples, we wanted to be with our own kind. And I hope it was they wanted to be with their own kind as opposed to being rejected at other places. And the final thing, you talk about planting a seed, and that really is so much about my book. Oh, obviously, I'd love to sell 1 million books. Wouldn't that be great? I'd be famous. But really what I want to hear are stories like this. There was someone there's 2 women who interacted with my book, and I'm not going to name them. One said, I never went to church, never part of my life at all. But she said after reading your book as part of her business, she said, now when I drove by a church, I wondered what was going on inside there.
Mm.
Then the next month she said, I'm in a singing group, and I sing with some people, and they told me that on Friday nights, the Episcopalians get together and they do some singing. And I think I may go one time. And then sure enough, a month later, we talked. She goes, I went to the Episcopalian thing and we sang, and it was pretty good. I enjoyed it. I may even go back again. A month later, I talked with her, and she said, you know what? I actually went back to the Episcopalians and sang with them again. Now, I don't know if she ever went to church again. She may be going every week. She may not. But if nothing else, what my book did was lessen that negative reflexive action that so many people have when you bring up church. So now when someone brings up church to her, she won't have that negative reaction, or she may say, hey, I've read this book and now I go every Sunday. I don't know, but that is the story. Another woman who got through business, got introduced to the book. And she said, after to Richard, in the past month, I've gone to 3 different churches because I read your book and I said, I'm going to give it a try. And again, I don't know if she ever went back again, but there's someone who opened their heart and mind to the possibility of church. And that's really what I'm doing here. And that's really why I'm doing this.
I've built business teams all over the world, 50 different nations were represented on my most broad reaching team. And I found that every culture, every religion, the exception of one, if you'd call it a religion, but every people, they all got along fantastic. And again, I try and simplify things. I said, we just got one rule here, and the whole team, 15,000 people. They said, we will love and respect each other. That covers such a blanket of everything. And I used to tell them what I found is that if you put yourself out there, like-hearted people will find each other. Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Catholics, Protestants, whatever. Everybody got along. Everybody was great. Everybody was supportive. I never ran into any issues.
Yeah, it really is. Well, it's when people can relate to each other, I think, on a one-to-one basis too, as opposed to painting these broad brushes. We talked already about LGBTQ and what that means, but really when we get down to what does it mean as people? And it's the same thing at how my church welcomed me, and they taught me the meaning of we. So I just saw that, played out over and over again. I had a great experience at the mosque. So I'm leaving the mosque afterwards, and it's a mob scene. There's thousands of people there. And this guy walks up to me, and it happened to be the doorman at my mom's condo building. And so we had always exchanged, pleasantries. Hi, the weather, how you doing? It's hot outside. But he was so amazed to see me at his mosque and I was delighted to see him. And it just triggered something so that now every time I walked into my mom's condo, we'd stop and talk for a few minutes about how happy he was. He bought his first house, maybe something about his family, maybe something about my family. But just that interaction on a personal level, remove some inhibition and open the door for greater connection. And so you experience that all the time. Okay, this was not in the book, but afterwards, I had to get my car, pick it up at the shop, and they sent out a courtesy shuttle to pick me up. I read the driver's profile, and he's an author. And so I get in the car, go, oh, I'm writing a book. And he goes, I am too. And I could tell he was not from the United States. He was a Pakistani Muslim. And so I said, well, interestingly enough, I mentor a young Pakistani Muslim guy. And he's just a terrific young man. And I said, I'm trying to get him back in to increase his faith. And then we started talking about faith. Like, what could you suggest that I could give to him that he could do that? And we had the most beautiful interaction about our faiths. He wasn't trying to convert me. I wasn't trying to convert him. And in 19 minutes, we arrived at the car dealership, and he said, look, I've got something for you. He reaches in his bag and pulls out a Quran for me and says, hey, just so you could have this.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then we exchanged phone numbers, and we're no longer in communication, but for a couple of years we were texting each other back and forth. Hey, how's your book going? And all that sort of stuff. So I've had so many, if you open yourself up, you'll have so many wonderful experiences. And I certainly have. But if I may, I want to really share kind of the crowning achievement in the book, or the crowning achievement of community in the book. And it involves my mother. So you asked, well, I was raised Catholic, and how was that moving to another church? Well, my mom was an 82-year-old Catholic at the time, always been Catholic. And when she heard about this church journey, she said, I guess it's fine, but remember, your soul is stained with the mark of Catholicism. So that's all I was dealing with, a little Catholic guilt.
Stained with the mark of Catholicism.
Yes,
what did she mean by that?
So,
like you were branded?
I don't know what she thought, but that's what she thought. And my mom, her health had been declining, really, her mobility had been declining. She could no longer go to church. And finally, it had declined to a point where I had to find a place to incarcerate her for the rest of her life. Well, there just so happened to be an assisted living facility across the street from my church. And I moved her in there. And I said, hey, Mom, now you want to go back to church again? Because literally she couldn't even get in and out of a car. It couldn't be walking distance. It had to be rolling distance, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
So she said, yeah, okay, I'll go. Well, she walks into this church, and the music's loud. It's not anything like Catholic service. And I'm not saying my mom's racist, but me and her were the only white people in the church. And literally the first few times she went and she almost cried. She teared up, like, what does my life come to? And the people in our church would try to come around and say hi. They were a little bit shocked when they saw her crying, and then they would just wave and say hello. But I will tell you, within the course of a month, she had a conversion that Billy Graham never had. She would hit the door with her hands clapping, voice upraised in song, foot tapping. And after every service, it was a scene out of The Godfather on the occasion of the Godfather's daughter's wedding. No less than 20 people would mob her and hug on her and love on her. And my mom, she couldn't move. She didn't talk that much. Maybe she'd talk a sentence. I oversaw her finances. She never gave a penny to the church. The church entirely embraced her, entirely loved on her. When it came time for the Christmas play, the senior group said, okay, we're going to make her a costume and put her on the Christmas play. Well, I said, you know what she can do, she can't do. Don't worry, we don't care. They constructed an outfit for her because she couldn't get up and change clothes, like a hospital gown, so she could put it in there. Someone wheeled her up on the stage so she could play one of the women. It's in some scene of some biblical scene. It was just fantastic. Then what happened is I travel, visit family, whatever, just to travel. So 2 women stepped up to serve her guardians. They said, Richard, we know you travel. Guess what? We don't want her to miss church. So when you're out of town, we're going to bring her back and forth. And so one of the two women would take her back and forth. In the last 18 months of her life, she only missed church one time because of a driving rainstorm. But that's not the real story. Last Easter 2024, I'm out of town visiting grandchildren. And they take her to church, and it's Easter Sunday. They take her back, and one of the guardians texts me and says, "Hey, Richard, your mom's not feeling well." And I was like, well, big deal. She's an old lady. She doesn't feel well. Well, about 6 hours later, the assisted living says she's on the way to the hospital. So, boom, I texted the guardians. Well, one of them, Shupon, almost beat the other branch of the family, my nephew, to the hospital. She had the bag with her pajamas and slippers inside and held my mom's hand until she passed away the next morning. And that's the kind of community that you might find at church.
Yeah.
And so that's why I am very enthusiastic about church. That's why I want to encourage people to seize the benefit of community worship. That's why I jokingly say that no matter how late I'm at the club, no matter how hungover I am on Sunday morning, and no matter where I am in the world, I am at church. And it's true. Lisbon, Portugal, a couple of years ago, I'm off the cruise ship at 9:30 in the morning, Sunday morning. At 11:30, I'm at the Riverfront Church in Lisbon going to church. You can't keep me out of it.
Fun stuff. Well, as we go out the door here, it's been really wonderful getting to know you. I really appreciate you so much and the message that you bring. Is there anything that you want to leave with your audience as we wave goodbye and farewell and leave the door?
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity. And I've certainly enjoyed this, Val. You're delightful to talk with. And I enjoyed learning more about you and hearing about your journey also. I would just encourage people to kind of set aside a lot of preconceived notions that they may have about church, that everyone's going to be self-righteous and judgmental. The sermon's going to be hellfire and brimstone. And I assure you, those circumstances exist, but they will be very few and far between. So I encourage you, put aside some preconceived notions. Explore church. You will have to go, and you should go to several churches, many churches, maybe even branching outside your faith. And ultimately, what I am seeking to do is encourage people to seize the benefit of community worship. Now, I want to sell books, but really my goal is that by the end of this year, that I will have exposed 10,000 people to the message and encourage them to seize the benefit of community worship.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us today on the First Chapter podcast. It was great to spend time with you. And now we want to flip over and listen to Richard read part of his book.
The idea of regularly attending church started on a whim, and I added a trick to make it more interesting and thus increase the probability of success. As an entirely irregular and wholly uninspired churchgoer, I needed something to get me attending services frequently and willingly. The hope was that attending church would be beneficial. I am ashamed to admit it, but I needed something beyond the classic religious obligation. Rather than church attendance being a necessary part of practicing faith, I hoped that attendance would increase my faithfulness. It was a simple, passive, guilt by association approach. The trick was giving myself something to look forward to each week beyond the same song and dance. So, I decided to attend services at houses of worship of all different religions, denominations, demographics, and locations around my home in a North Dallas suburb. Even with my newfound ambition, I set a modest goal of 60% or 32 times over the next year. Remember, my church-going record was poor, and I worried my commitment to this newfound endeavor might be equally weak. Many born before 2000 grew up regularly attending church services, but current attendance is at or near all-time lows. Today, mentioning church often provokes a reflexive negative reaction. Former and current attendees may have encountered services with judgmental and condemning messages in churches that were full of equally judgmental and condemning people. We also know that church members commit crimes and other harmful acts. Monolithic churches and high-living preachers create the impression that these places are greedy or wasteful. Yes, there are bad actors and actions, but they are contrary to the church's teaching. While they justifiably reflect poorly on a church, they are not the church or faith. As for me, a cradle Catholic, I knew that going to church was something I ought to do. My mom ensured my sister and I obtained the required sacraments or religious milestones, but afterward, she quit going or making us go. Mom resurrected her interest when the grandchildren came so they could receive the sacraments. Dad never went. As an adult, I attended in fits and spurts and a little more intentionally when my children arrived. But at the end of the day, infrequent is the best word to describe my lifetime attendance. I did not get much from attending church. Like many, I found Mass tedious and difficult to endure. The fault lies with my lack of initiative and receptivity, much more than with the beautifully reverent Catholic Mass. Despite my lack of practice, faith was and is important to me. 10 years before this journey, a group of acquaintances formed a loosely named faith group. When we are not talking about work, family, or cycling, our close-knit circle reads and discusses a faith-based book, then prays. Only 2 of these friends regularly attend church. With these perceptions, anecdotal evidence, and my background, why did I decide to give church attendance another try? In short, there was a nagging feeling that church could be beneficial. The institution of the church aspires toward virtuous living and is an environment with the potential to meet that ambition. Despite declining attendance, many people love and benefit from attending church, and I believe joining with others would help grow my faith. And so I began. The selection methodology was simple: typing churches near me into my web browser and pressing enter. I wanted as much variety as possible and was relatively indiscriminate with my selections. Except when traveling, virtually every church was within 5 miles of my house. In addition to maintaining my interest, the variety was also a means to learn about other faiths. We labor under the assumption of knowledge based on a surface familiarity. We equate knowing members of a faith tradition with knowledge of the faith. It may be the functional equivalent of saying, "I have black friends," as a basis for understanding the black experience when we have never been to their house or had them in ours, much less walked in their shoes to the extent possible. When I mentioned my church journey to others, many remarked that they thought they knew other faiths, but reconsidered and acknowledged that they never or rarely attended services outside of their religious denomination. In the beginning, I wondered if I would be barred entry where I did not belong, be viewed with scrutiny, receive the cold shoulder, be assaulted by cult members enticing me to join, encounter religious zealots, be badgered for a donation, subjected to hellfire and damnation sermons, hear bleeding heart or far-right political messages. There was also a slim chance that I would find happy, faithful people welcoming me into their home. The journey was a solo one for the most part. I am an empty nester, and my wife is even more irregular and uninspired with her religious practice. The solitary nature of the journey facilitated church selection and attendance times since I did not have to consider anyone else's interests. until I did. Going alone also allowed me to view the experiences from my sole perspective and freed me from, and might have deprived me of, the influence of another's interpretation. I realize I am treading into dangerous territory with religion as a topic, and I willingly enter into the abyss with several prefatory comments. My journey is about the concept and need for a church more than any specific religious principles. As I recount my experiences, I use general vocabulary for simplicity's sake, while acknowledging my words may be imprecise or border on inaccuracy. For example, I use church as a universal term, even though a house of worship might be called a church, temple, mosque, or meeting hall. Faith refers to a belief in God and sometimes a religious denomination. Church attendance is not faith, but a faith practice. The descriptions of my church visits are a personal survey of church services, not a comparative religion or theology study. First, attending one service is not the most effective way to learn a religion's theology. The sample size is too small to draw definitive conclusions, as worship services can vary widely at a single church or within a denomination. For example, a Catholic church may have a variety of permissible service styles: teen, family, high, low, over the course of one weekend. Second, I do not possess the educational background to opine extensively on my religious denomination, much less on others. However, my layman's perspective was an asset, as I was not mired in the details nor caught parsing each religious concept. I do not identify the specific churches in the chapters on the visits. The lack of identification is purposeful, as I do not intend to criticize or embarrass any church, especially as I found great merit and was treated wonderfully at almost every church. In almost every circumstance where I use critical or negative language, its use is primarily ironic, as the criticism soon evaporates in the cloud of my hypocrisy. I apologize in advance for the words that offend, as any offense is entirely unintended. In addition, my observational approach, incomplete memory, and imperfect writing inevitably yield some inaccuracies. I do not intend to be misleading, nor did I create fiction merely to prove a point. I suggest reading the book as if listening to a long story over dinner. While I have been focusing on my guidelines for attending services, this book is really a story about human nature, faith traditions and values, race relations, the definition of church, and the power of community. Its purpose is to share what I encountered and learned, as well as my transformation. And while I hope to inspire, the book is not an evangelical call to practice any particular religion. To the extent possible, I put my preconceived notions and anxieties aside and approached each church visit with an open mind and heart. My curiosity allowed me to observe without seeking to confirm any uncertain suspicions. I was receptive to whatever I encountered, and this perspective richly rewarded me. When I embarked on this journey, I knew where I was going, but did not know what I would find. What I learned is that there is a place for everyone, and everyone needs a place. Can we do it?